right, good afternoon. I'm Andrew Norris. It's my great pleasure to introduce our next speaker for the conference, Professor Eli Friedlander. Professor Friedlander is professor of philosophy at Tel Aviv University, and he is currently the Humboldt Fellow at the Center for Post-Kantian Philosophy at Potsdam. He is the author of books on Wittgenstein, 2001 Signs of Sense, reading Wittgenstein's Tractatus, Rousseau, 2004's Jean-Jacques Rousseau, An Afterlife of Words, Kant, 2015's Expressions of Judgment, an essay on Kant's aesthetics, and Walter Benjamin, 2012's Walter Benjamin, A Philosophical Portrait, and 2024 Walter Benjamin and the Idea of Natural History. I believe Professor Friedlander is the only person in the world to have written books on all those authors, and I think he is likely to remain the holder of that honor. He is going to speak to us today on receptivity at the heart of language, Walter Benjamin's idealism. He has asked me to direct you to pose questions in English, please, not in German. And with that, please join me in welcoming Professor Friedlander.
Thank you so much, Andrew, and thank you, Thomas, Alexei, Patrick, for your kind invitation. It's really a great pleasure to be here and see the faces here, the faces of many friends from different periods, as well as many friendly faces. Let's hope they will remain so by the end of the talk. So the reference to Benjamin's idealism in the title of my talk should be taken rather broadly as pointing to his intervention in the tradition of German thought, starting from and including Kant, the Romantics, Hölderlin, and Goethe. More specifically, I want to clarify how it is an idealism of reception by way of reading his early essay on two poems of Friedrich Hölderlin. Before getting into it, I need to explore a few themes that will form toward the backdrop of my reading. And even before that, let me say that I'm in no way a reader or scholar of Hölderlin, and will be only concerned with what Benjamin makes of him. My only excuse for interpreting an interpretation is that the essay of the 21-year-old Benjamin is one of the most difficult texts I've read ever. The other is what the 24-year-old Wittgenstein was writing at the time. And since I see here some Wittgensteinians, I will, at time, turn to him. Okay, so I begin with the fragment known as the earliest system program of German idealism, discovered among Hegel's papers in his handwriting, but often attributed either to Hölderlin, to Schelling, or to all three. It opens with the call to transform and expand Kant's doctrine of the practical postulates. The existence of God and the immortality of the soul are postulates necessary to direct our existence to the highest good. Yet what it means to call them postulates and how exactly they are to promote the highest good is not that evident. I think that's one of the main themes of the book that Lara Osterich referred to yesterday, the philosophical letters on criticism and dogmatism. So calling them practical for sure distinguishes them from theoretical cognition, from being identified with dogmatic attempts at knowledge of the transcendent. But it does little to explain how they are expressed, say, as principles of willing. The postulates taken together with the deduction of freedom can be said to give practical reality to the three ideas, world, soul, and God. But the text of the system program calls for a more Platonic reading, where the postulates amount to a complete system of ideas ruled by the three transcendentals: truth, goodness, and beauty. I have some quotes. I won't always read them, but you'll have the text to which I refer behind my back. The highest act of reason that comprises all ideas is an aesthetic act, and truth and goodness are united like sisters only in beauty. So it is art rather than principles of the will that opens the fundamental orientation to what is highest. In the words of the system program, poetry thereby obtains a higher dignity. It becomes again, in the end, what it was at the beginning, teacher of the human race. At the beginning, poetry was mythology. And at the end as well, the program calls for a new mythology. This mythology must, however, stand in the service of ideas. It must become a mythology of reason. In reading the earliest system program, one might get the impression that the poet is supposed to invent fictions, new gods, to make ideas efficient for the people who cannot grasp them in their purely reasonable form. As though the poet is a version of Rousseau's legislator, of the way people sometimes read Rousseau's legislator. Yet mythology originally is not the invention of an individual, but rather a collective expression, so to speak, a blossoming of nature in the human form of life. A new mythology, similarly, cannot be understood merely as the achievement of individual genius, or at least it would demand a transformation, a radical transformation of the creative, what the creative counts as, suggested in the system program by the following line: a higher spirit sent from heaven must establish this religion among us. It will be the last work of the human race. Yet, how does the poet return to earth that which has been sent from heaven? How does the poet lend a hand to let the people be receptive to a higher destiny? This question forms the first connection to Hölderlin's Blödigkeit and to Benjamin's essay. And we could cut here to that essay, but I think a further preliminary consideration might help with its difficulties. So, before getting to my elucidation of Benjamin's reading of Hölderlin, let me describe again in very, very general terms some different models of what it means to make ideas sensuous. In section 59 of the Critique of the Power of Judgment, Kant distinguishes an immediate, schematic, and a mediate, symbolic ascription of intuitions to concepts. In the latter, the imagination forms an analogy in taking the rule of reflection on a particular sensuous object and applying it indirectly to the reflection on an idea, making thereby the idea sensuous. It is through such an analogy that one can think of how rational ideas are made visible, say, in the figures of the gods. Now, in his aesthetics, Hegel takes issue with the symbolic, analogical, or merely allegorical presentation of the divine, which he identifies in the monumentality of the art of the ancient Near East, and sees it as the inevitable result of a still immature, abstract concept of the divine. Concretization, first of all, of the content, in which the tension between sensuous particularity and infinite ideality is resolved, is achieved in classical art, foremost in the sculptural rendition of the gods in a human form. In that plastic presentation of the ideal of art, the human body becomes the best picture of the human soul, the locus of a heightened manifestation of soulfulness. At issue is not a passing expression of the body in certain situations caused by external or internal events, but the total permeation of a spiritual character trait equally evident everywhere in the body. It is therefore at the same time an image of utter self-sufficiency. Sculpture is particularly adequate to present this divine blessed isolation insofar as it exists surrounded, so to speak, by space alone, apart from any background. Now, Schelling's starting point determines what he calls the symbol, not to be confused with what Kant or Hegel call the symbolic. It is the mirror image of absolute identity. Identity expressed in judgment is for sure a tautology, but absolute identity is not a judgment. It is a prejudice, if you want, which can only be recognized as its unfolding is mirrored in the finite. Identity opens into a threefold of what Schelling calls potences. There is the affirming aspect, and there is the affirmed aspect of it, and there is the identity of the affirming and the affirmed. The affirming active aspect would be the ideal or intelligible one. The affirmed or receptive is the real all. The one and all, to use Spinoza's locution that was not far from Schelling's mind, would be the interpenetration of the ideal and the real to the point of indifference. Now, maybe as a result of starting with identity, Schelling gives the problem of a poetic mythology something like a Neoplatonic articulation. Identity is one, and being origin, it raises the question, how can multiplicity, the many, emerge, if at all, from the one? The many, of course, is not the endless number of particulars in space and time, but rather the discrete multiplicity of the order of ideas, or what comes to the same in the real, the higher multiplicity of the gods. The many, in that sense, cannot be defined as real parts of the one, but rather must be conceived as, let's say, world aspects. To put it in Spinozistic language, the gods are more like infinite attributes than like modes. This suggests that poetizing in the light of identity must ultimately be understood as striving for the presentation of world coherence. As we make our way finally to Hölderlin's transformation of mythology, poetry does not seek the presentation of the gods in the self-sufficiency of their blessed existence. This, of course, does not mean, as it does in Hegel, that art now becomes romantic and presents primarily the separation of subjectivity from a world that is emptied of any inherent significance, turning inwardness into the medium in which the absolute is now manifest. Rather, the task of the poet, to speak again in the terms of the system program, is to bring forth a higher spirit sent from heaven, establishing thereby a unity of destiny for the people. True to the logic of identity, the generation of poetic space does away with the presence of independent elements, be them gods, the people, or the poet. Those must appear only in partaking in the wholeness of world coherence. One way to express this disappearance of independent elements would be to say that all becomes reciprocal relation. This is indeed Benjamin's formulation of the poetic law of identity, which you have quoted here. This law of identity states that all unities appear in intensive interpenetration, that the elements are never purely graspable. No element can be ever singled out, void of relation from the intensity of the world order, which is fundamentally felt. I won't go into the way in which this is basically Benjamin's principle of feeling, an alternative, let's say, to Kant's idea of purposiveness without purpose. But let's go into the essay. So Benjamin's On Two Poems of Friedrich Hölderlin brings out how the intensive interpenetration, the concentration of relations, is achieved in Hölderlin's rewriting of a poem entitled The Poet's Courage, Dichtermut, into a later version entitled Timidity, Blödigkeit. The logic of this transition, or self-translation, is precisely that of ridding the poem of independent elements or figures. The following question can therefore serve as an entry point for our reading of the essay. What could be the interpenetration of the intelligible and the sensuous if it does not present us with particular beings in space and time? Wouldn't the turn to pure relationship make the poem into a mere functional system in which the sensuous presence essential to art is completely lost? I think this is in some sense correct, but it leaves us the option of conceiving of poetizing purely in terms of the forms of sensibility, space and time. Each of the dimensions is laid out as a purely spatio-temporal configuration, as it were as a poetic schematism, or to follow more precisely the distinctions I've made, a poetic symbolism. The integral unity of destiny in all its dimensions must therefore receive a spatio-temporal expression in terms of extension, the plane, plasticity, the vertical, the horizontal, the center, the turn, inside, outside, intensive force, repetition, and so on. So I put up, apologizing in advance to this Berlin audience, an English translation of a German poem, and parts of which I will highlight as I speak. I also reiterate that I merely comment here on Benjamin's essay, and so will refrain from adding after every turn of phrase, as Benjamin says, as Benjamin writes, as Benjamin puts it. Okay, this goes without saying. I'm just repeating here. Okay, let us first consider the spatio-temporal configuration relating poet and people in the first two stanzas. As a multitude, the people are the real spread out, existing in non-delimited and non-oriented endlessness. The extensive plane, the horizontal ground, figures this neutral space of possibility in which one can arbitrarily choose directions. The line, of course, is the simplest schema of relatedness in the plane. Choice would perhaps be figured as a split in the line, a crossroad. Yet, through their being known to the poet, right, are not the many living known to you, poetry turns unformed extension into a space ordered as destiny. The plane is no more a myriad of points related contingently to one another, offering countless arbitrary directions or choices. Rather, there is a joining together. This is not an external relation, but bears equally on all, is the same to everyone. Joining, in turn, must be understood through the figure of the carpet. Does not your foot stride upon the true as upon carpets? A carpet is a weave, merely the crisscross of threads that thereby hold together, that is, without being externally tied to one another. The overarching order is revealed by the movement of the poet, his striding upon the true. Not as if there is a path that is the true path among other possibilities. Rather, the striding must exemplify what fit with the world as such, that is beyond choice, comes to. right? Whatever happens, let it be opportune for you. Movement is not determined by purpose that singles parts of the world, but always ultimately gets its bearing and orientation out of the coherence of the whole. Each step equally reflects what is one and the same, or exemplifies the same to everyone. The spatial determination then is not this or that situation or state of affairs, and the temporal determination is not just what happens. To follow the figure of the carpet, or rather the figure in the carpet, the spatial temporal mirroring of identity is an overall pattern in which everything fits and is thereby equally opportune. The coherence of relations is, as Benjamin suggests, not only objective, but also the subjective exemplarity of the poet, whose movement affords the perspicuous overview of the pattern example, das Muster. Indeed, the joining together that is joyful is clearly identified with the poetic task in the expression be rhymed to joy. This does not mean that rhyming has a direct object that is joy. The poetic joining opens to, as Wittgenstein would put it, the unity of a happy world. I note again in passing that in the Tractatus from which this locution is taken, the essential, which is joined without external relations, is figured by the links in a chain, right? That is like the weave in one dimension. In the philosophical investigations, weave and pattern also serve Wittgenstein to express a similar point, though not in terms of joy, but rather of grief. And I quote, grief describes a pattern which recurs with different variations in the weave of our life. Okay, to the emergence of destiny for the people corresponds a spatio-temporal configuration relating the heavenly and the mortals. It is articulated primarily in the fifth stanza, whereas the real, the people, were figured through the horizontal plane, that is the opaque supporting ground. Here what is at issue is the vertical element of transparent ideality. Again, it is tempting to start with the one-dimensional, with the line. The God of heaven holds us upright on golden leading strings. And the relation of father and children might moreover suggest a clear hierarchy, and as it were, attribute to the God the rule over the destiny of mortals. Nevertheless, reciprocity inherent in the concentration of relationships emerge, according to Benjamin, in the transformation of the joyful day, in the first version of the poem, which you do not have here, into the thinking day, in the final version. Put in terms of our previous considerations, the joyful is internal to the poetic task, to the joining, and so cannot be a gift, a blessing of the gods to be graced with and passively accepted. Thinking, on the other hand, is called for as its element. Clarity is merely granted or not begrudged. So what allows thinking is identified in the medial character of light. The spatial characterization here demands to be complemented in the temporal order, identified as the turning Wende of time. Turn is turning back, thus what returns and closes upon itself. Yet the return that makes for thinking is not given by the reflective self-consciousness. This is important. It is the unity of space and time encapsulated as the day. So time does not merely extend indefinitely, but rather the identity is mirrored in that which turns back and repeats, constituting the expanse of the day-to-day. The everyday is indeed what does not belong to the few, say only to the rich, but to all, poor and rich. But the diurnal is not only the light of the day. The turn of time is also the turning aside of light. This is expressed, for instance, in the dissonance of the line where the light rays hold the sleeping upright, right? For one shouldn't sleep, so it seems, if there's light outside. It is also suggested, as Benjamin points out, in the sole appearance of color that is golden in this line, at least if one understands color with Goethe as always involving the duality of light and shadow. The mirroring of identity in these dimensions then relate to some kind of duality of revealing and veiling that is internal to sleep. And I quote, Benjamin, manifest once again is the deepest identity of form in sleep. This is presumably a reference to the dream. So paradoxically, I would say the deepest identity of form is not form, but deformation. And I think it might not be as misguided as it sounds to seek the mirroring of identity in the distortions of the dream. Because in the dream, things lose their existence as isolated particulars, each with their own identity. They acquire their meaning in their affinities or reciprocal relations, through their participation, say, in the totality. As Benjamin puts it in another context, I quote again from the essay, The Image of Proust, the similarity of one thing to another, which we are used to, which occupies us in a wakeful state, reflects only vaguely the deeper similarity of the dream world, in which everything that happens appears not in identical, but in similar guise, opaquely similar to itself. Again, I note in passing that the investigation of the everyday, indeed as a dream configuration, is a theme in many of Benjamin's writing all the way to the end, and maybe most obviously in the Arcades project. As he puts it there, we do not merely have a Zeitraum, but a Zeittraum. Okay, the turn of time is to be read together with other figures of turning in the poem, and in particular in relation to how the heavenly ones themselves were led towards ingathering. The contemplative turn or pose defines the position of the poet in relation to the realm of ideas. To grasp this restfulness of what returns to itself, we need to introduce a dimension of force that belongs to the intensive character of identity. At issue, then, is not a force that acts in space and time. Rather, we are to conceive of the ideas as the actualization or objectification of an absolute force or of the absolute as force. Think, for example, of the duality of will and its complete objectification in ideas in Schopenhauer, Schelling, similar structure. The actualization of force is not expressed in the extended plane, nor in the vertical medium of light, but rather in the character of plastic existence in space and time. So the intensively plastic, right, is not just the inert, self-same, three-dimensional empirical object that just takes the space it happens to take. Rather, plastic fullness must appear as the resting point of an inward creative force. Sometimes Benjamin refers to it as the punched out form. Since one cannot turn back, as it were, towards the absolute identity, the inner center of force must itself be conceived as turned inside out, that is, turned out into the fully objectified form. For those of you who were there in May, when I give another talk, this is the sock structure, basically, pair of socks from the Berlin childhood. Even the formless transparency of space, the element in which light is manifest intensively, even this receives an architectonic concreteness as the formed, all-encompassing sky. the vault of heaven is not only the arched dome, but also the burial chamber in which the force, that is the dark ground, is fully actualized, that is deadened in the plastic form. Okay, this is, again, paraphrase of Benjamin, who speaks in very strange terms of the idea of a buried form and some idea of mortification that has to do with the emergence of the realm of ideas. We can finally consider the place of the poet or of poetry in establishing this turning back and turning inside out in which the plane of the earth and the vault of heaven come to face each other. This might be the place to address something like a riddle in Benjamin's essay, and through it also clarify the nature of the absolute idealism of reception. The essay reflects on the sense in which one can attribute a task to poetry, right? On how courage is the virtue of the poet faced with that task. While the title of the first version of the poem, The Poet's Courage, might suggest the figure of the poet hero, the title of the second version, Timidity, raises a difficulty. How can the higher transformation of active courage amount to the passivity of the timid? Okay, so courage or encouragement is implicit in many ways in the poem, in the injunction, like, have no care, as well as in the exclamation, what then could offend you, heart, or what befall you, there where you must go. But is courage demanded in a state in which, as Wittgenstein puts it in the lecture on ethics, one is inclined to say, I'm safe, nothing can injure me, whatever happens? Isn't courage required when one is not safe from the start, where there is risk, danger that something might in fact happen? If nothing can offend anymore, why is courage necessary? Wilhelm Weiblinger, the earliest biographer of Hölderlin, reports that in his so-called years of madness, he used to repeat often the phrase, nothing happens to me. So why would complete isolation from life amount to courage? Isn't it rather surrender or collapse in the face of the difficulties of living? The overcoming of the duality of active and passive should not at this point come as a surprise. It belongs to the expression of absolute identity and is not foreign, for instance, to the logic of tragedy. Tragedy, let's say for Schelling, is a model for the symbolic identity of real and ideal, that is, of necessity and freedom. The hero or heroine of tragedy is absolutely free to surrender. That is, to appropriate as their own the guilt of a transgression determined by fate. Establishing the position of the poet must similarly be formulated as indifferent to the poles of activity and passivity. This is suggested, as Benjamin points out in the line, good too are we incapable, sent to someone to some end. The word geschickt refers equally to an active capacity, to being skilled, and to a passive being determined, that is, being sent. Determining and determined, Benjamin writes, the poet appears among the living. So the poet is neither a craftsman relying on his own skill, nor a prophet dispatched by higher powers. Moreover, we have a duality of meaning that is not quite two registers of, let's say, literal and figurative. Right? Benjamin writes, the words attain their perceptual meaning in the poem without sacrificing the figurative. While the poetic logic we've sketched does away with analogies in favor of the all-encompassing relationship, there is nonetheless a transport that occurs and is not a figuration of some content or other. That is the moment which Hölderlin identifies in his remarks on Oedipus as the caesura, the empty transport from the alternating representations to the plane of representation itself. And again, I'm not an expert on Hölderlin, but I want to suggest how our interpretation up to now may provide some understanding of this moment. It is tantamount to the disappearing of the structure of representation or judgment, and thus identified with the disappearance, on the one hand, of the poet as an individual subject in the world, and on the other, of the specific content represented. Both are absorbed in the emergence of poetic world coherence, the delimited world. Right? The poet is nothing but a limit with respect to life, the point of indifference. Again, to quote for the fun of it, Wittgenstein, the solitary self shrinks to a point without extension, and there remains the reality coordinated with it. Right? So the metaphysical or poetic subject is the limits of the world. I'm getting to the end of my talk, but let me open a parenthesis. Since the issue of limits and boundaries has come up in some of the talks, we tend to figure limits as periphery, right? Say as boundary or a circle. But one can also call the center of the circle its inner limit, right? It is a limit that emerges, as Benjamin points out, in the movement of concentration. Say, when one moves from a loose to a concentrated version of the same poem, right? It is to this sense of limit that Benjamin refers in speaking of the poetized as a limiting concept. Okay, so let me wrap up. Establishing the place of the poet beyond our usual ways of understanding the duality of active and passive is also what makes his position one of absolute receptivity. And I quote Benjamin, "Timidity has now become the authentic stance of the poet. Since he has been transposed into the middle of life, nothing awaits him but motionless existence, complete passivity, which is the essence of the courageous man, nothing except to surrender himself wholly to relationship." Right? So nothing can offend his heart, since the poet is this disappearing art, the center or the concentration of relationships that emanate from him and return to him. Far from attributing to the poet a central presence, the center means precisely the vanishing of the poet as subject, remaining with pure world coherence. The moment that Benjamin identifies in the poem as the intrusive caesura, yet we ourselves bring apt hands, completes the striking depersonalization of the poet. Even his body is not quite his own. He brings hands and the heavenly ones. Thank you.
Any questions?
Yeah, thank you very much for the talk. And I have a short question. I was thinking about the problem of the limit. Poetry as at the limit of the world, of life. And thinking, I was thinking, maybe Wittgenstein meant that the poetry is at the limit of the capacity of the language to express something. And because poetry is also, does also force the boundaries of the language in order to describe something that ordinary language does not or cannot describe. So what do you think about?
Yeah, well, I'm, there are different ways of reading Wittgenstein, and I'm sort of trying to associate myself with the resolute reading in terms of the Tractatus, meaning I don't see Wittgenstein as pointing to something beyond language, beyond ordinary language, that some kind of intuition, poetic intuition, so on, can grasp, but not our language. I really think that there are lots of connections that I think could be made between the way I was describing Hölderlin, and maybe that's because it is my way of describing it, but I think it's also Benjamin's, and Wittgenstein. I mean, just this idea that somehow the ethical will requires being in agreement with the world, right? It's not a will that is defined by specific acts in the world. It is a will that makes the world a happy world, Wittgenstein says. And so really it's a sense of a limited world, or a world in which, as it were, when it is significant, when it is happy, it is the limited world. And I would say, you lose the sense of world coherence in an unhappy world. But that's the only movement I would speak of, yeah.
Thank you very much, Eli. Very interesting and convincing reading. Now, talks have limits, time limits, so you couldn't consider the first version. But my sense is, and always was, that everything one can say about the second version is in a way undercut by the first version, not so much by the fact that two versions exist, but that the accomplishment and the purpose of the essay is to show why the second one does something the first one doesn't. And it seems to me that this does something to the arguments or to the interpretations one subjects the second version to. Could you say something about this?
Yeah, I mean, very, very generally, what Benjamin says about, or what he complains about in the first version, is that there is something like a figuration of the God, that the gods that is, as it were, independent. So, the poem produces an analogy between the setting of the sun in beauty and the poet that goes towards death in beauty. By the way, when I read the section 59 of the third critique, this is Kant's example. It's really striking. He's, as an example of how you can, as it were, speak about ideas. He gives the setting of the sun as an image for going towards death. So anyway, but I don't think there's any direct connection. But he says, well, this is mythology. And mythology means there's some way of holding to the figure of the god independently. Therefore, there's a way in which the gods are, as it were, separated and given, what I said, the authority over destiny. What you need is, puts it in terms of, it's like the hands of a balance, right? Everything is reciprocal.
Yes, and devoid of relation, he says.
No, all is relation.
That was in your quote.
Everything is relationship. There's no external relation. Everything. So if everything is relation, there's no substantive individual things that are related. That's, I think, the point of the principle of identity. You can't have things that are elements that are related. When everything is relation, elements, no, I mean, it was all around in logic, right? Cassirer, Carnap, but
why go through why not just give the interpretation? Why go through the motion
oh,
of
okay.
comparing the versions?
Because this is concentration. Because this is how you produce a limit. I mean, think of the essay on elective affinities. It's the same idea. There's the novel and there's the novella. And the novella is the concentration. And therefore, it's clear, it's sober, and so on. While, there's the penumbra of the novel where fate rules. And something about that movement is reproduced, is suggested as the form of critique, in basically concentrate and even, I would say, reach the limit which does not quite belong to the poem anymore, Benjamin says, but also to life. So something like the truth of the poem.
Ellie, your strategy was to take us with Benjamin through the poem, and that worked extremely well, I have to say, and I felt that I experienced the poem again through him and through you. So thank you for that. But there's also what we might call a meta-discursive aspect to the essay, and I would like to invite you to comment on that. In particular, I wonder if you could give us what your view is of the three terms that he sets into relationship with one another as a kind of basic conceptual triad of his methodology. Those terms are das Gedicht, on the one hand, this particular poem that I'm going to analyze. On the other hand, das Leben, and in the middle, das Gedichtete.
Yeah.
And das Gedichtete is the object of knowledge of the, I may be formulating this wrong, you can change it, but roughly speaking, the object of knowledge produced by the critical activity. And the nature of that object of knowledge is that it relates, again, relation, that it relates these two other elements one to another, the Gedicht and Leben. It is as if Gedicht and Leben themselves were not articulable, but only in this relationship that is established by the articulate Gedichtete do they come into relationship with one another, or perhaps do they come into visibility for us.
Yeah.
The reason that these first two, Leben and Gedicht, are not articulable is that, according to Benjamin, they are infinite. So that's something that I would invite you to explicate. One doesn't have a lot of difficulty maybe thinking life in its totality, infinite. Little tougher on the side of the poem, because the poem refers to this particular poem.
Yeah.
So if you could comment on the methodological, as it were, infrastructure of the essay, that would be, I think, extremely helpful.
Yeah, this is not easy, as you know, but let me try. I mean, let's start maybe with what's wrong, according to Benjamin, when you think of poetry as putting life into the poem. That is, you end up with putting some kind of emphasis on personal experiences and so on that you have to translate into poetic language, and that can't be right. And of course, he doesn't want the poem merely as a formal construct, but as you said, he wants the emerges onto life, but only through the structuration of the poem. And I think one way to put it in terms of the notion of symbol, which I discussed, is the following. I mean, I'm taking a figure from Benjamin's interpretation of Kant, but I think it fits here. He speaks about the relation between experience and knowledge of experience. I mean, the big Kantian question, how do you get to think they're coming to the same? And he says, well, think of a painter in front of a landscape. He, of course, looks at the landscape in order to paint it, but it's not as though you have to say, something like, well, okay, the landscape life is the model which I, in some sense, reproduce in the structured, the formed painting. No, he's saying, really, what you should say is that through the painting, you emerge for the first time onto the landscape, right? The higher experience, so to speak, is precisely what is opened up by the knowledge of experience, that is by this internal forming. And the structure is very much like that with this idea. You get, he says, to the a priori of the poem, as it were, but only through this way in which you recognize the movement that leads to, yeah, a limit, but a limit understood in terms of center, concentration. Concentration, which means disappearance of all the subjective elements of the poem and of all the isolated thoughts, figures, analogy, and so on. Now, I would say, so the poetize is not, again, you could say it's what you put into poetry, but I think in German that would work, right? Gedichtete is, can also mean what you put into the, what you put into poetry. But anyway, it's not. It's what emerges and in some sense does not belong to the poem anymore. It is the truth of the poem. And the truth of the poem in Benjamin always, or the truth of a literary work always in some sense demands some kind of destruction, of a certain idea of unity of the poem. Now, the poem is infinite, not in the sense of an infinite task or something like that. It's infinite because you recognize it as a self-enclosed whole, right? But there's a way in which that totality is precisely what can lead you in the act of critique to something which, yeah, is the poetize, is the, what, where you emerge onto a structured life, as it were, through the poem. Something like that. We should talk about that more.
Okay, so hi, Ellie, thanks so much. I'm giving you an opportunity to talk about it some more right now. So sorry, I had the same question in mind, just in terms of understanding this threefold structure that David was bringing up, and maybe connecting it back to what we discussed yesterday in the morning in Lara's session with regard to the production of the absolute and the way in which the genius is producing something. Because I was struck by the way in which Benjamin sets the whole thing up, where he has this gedichtete, you called it the poetized. Yeah, okay, let's take that. The poetized. And so he says that, so he has this interesting description that uses the schema of problem and solution. So in a certain sense, for the creator, for the Schöpfer, the Leben is always the task or the problem in a certain sense, and the poem would be the solution. So like for the, in their mode of production of writing a poem, it seems like the life poses a problem for me that I then bring into the form of the poem in a certain sense. And so that would be quite a productive kind of schema.
Yeah.
But it seems, and you were already pointing to that in your response to David, that what is much more important, so what really comes about, is the Gedichtete, or the I mean, you're trying to write a poem, of course, that's what you do, and then this is the mode of production, and it's bureaucratic, to cite the first day as well, in a certain sense, so I ask these elements, but there's something else that you bring about that is, yeah. And then interestingly also, Benjamin describes as being aufgelockert in a certain sense. So it's less enclosed. It doesn't have the closeness of the poem. Yeah?
Exactly.
And so there's this interesting way in which you bring something about which is not actually the problem to your solution or the product. You can't do without that. So that's the poet needs to do it. That's their task, but their accomplishment is something else.
Yeah. Great. Yeah, no, I mean, you formulated it perfectly, and I don't know how much I have to add to the way you put it, but maybe we can bring out this theme that, and there's so much in this, you know, Benjamin, 21 years old Benjamin, that will run throughout his writing. I would say, what is the weave of space and time? It's the aura, right? The most, used term in Benjamin is this, starts here. And therefore, the aura is much more difficult than what is usually thought of. But specifically about this idea of question or problem-oriented thinking. I mean, you could place it within the neo-Kantian context. And in some ways, this idea of question or hypothesis and solution is a way of thinking of the infinite task with Hermann Cohen. And Benjamin, in many ways, tries to push back against this kind of structure. And in part, it has to do with saying, well, there is something which, let's call it existence, which cannot be an answer to a question. There's something about identity, which is not one of the relational categories. It's there, it's important in, let's say, rewriting of Kant, but it does not, you can't understand it in terms of, the three kinds of judgment, categorical, hypothetical, and reciprocal. And I think you can say in the Hölderlin essay, you have already something very similar. There is a need to speak of not the coherence of the poem, but something like the truth of the poem, for which you have to, in some sense, I use the term that he uses often against the romantic, you have to mortify. You don't remain with the semblance of totality, which becomes a problem when you look for the truth of the matter. And this idea of loosening or destroying is, again, a theme that you have it in the concept of critique in the essay on elective affinities, right? You start with the unity of truth content and material content. They can't be pulled apart. But somewhere along the road, there are peculiarities of the material content precisely that emerge and, as it were, destroy something like the initial unity of idea and the sensuous. And only then can you start thinking about the truth of the poem, precisely through what, in some sense, destroyed that unity. And again, I'm not saying it's exactly like that, but the idea of critique starts to sound as if it goes that way.
Yeah, thank you so much, Eli, for your talk. I was asking myself if we can understand your idea of the truth of poetry, of the poem, and of the a priori of the poem, and perhaps of the destruction of the poem itself, in relation to the question of translation. In the sense that in the task of translator, Benjamin says that Hölderlin is in a certain sense the model of the translator. And he says that it is not a case that Sophocles' translations are the last word of Hölderlin. And when he tried to explicate what kind of translation is this, this translation has nothing to do with communication. This translation has nothing to do with Inhalt, with the content. It is a translation that has to do with, I would say, sound of words with, also, no, not with the sounds of words, but with the signifiers and not with the signified, I would say. And so I wanted to ask you if there is a sort of connection between the reading of Benjamin's, of the two poems, and what Benjamin think about translation and about Hölderlin as model of translator, so to say.
Yeah, that's a great question. I think there is a very close connection, which also goes through the essay on language, but I'll leave that aside. My sense is this, I mean, of course, he says from the beginning, you know, communication is not the issue for the translation, is not helping you when you don't know a language to, and neither is creativity, that's off the table. There is this understanding that what you're bringing out is, in translation is an affinity between languages through, of course, working on the translation of the poem, right? It was an introduction to the translation of Baudelaire that Benjamin made. But what happens, what makes it raise to the level of, you know, languages rather than, yeah, specific contents? And I would say what happens there is the following. Benjamin says, you know, translation is such that, of course, in the original language, you have ways of meaning, as it were, you know, a certain intentional structure that leads you to the meaning. And his initial assumption is there's no corresponding way of meaning in the language of the translation. So basically he says you have to supplement the language, which is not, let's invent a way of meaning that is like the one that comes with the original. He thinks, again, in terms of certain kind of submitting the words to higher unity, that is, you know, echoing. It's not form anymore. It's, I think it's precisely, he says it's word for word, right? So you would say, well, where's the context? Where's the judgment in which the word gets its significance? That's true for, you know, the original, but he seems to say there is a certain kind of unity which you would call a unity that belongs to the language and not a specific word, as if you can use, you know, whatever you have in the target language to echo the way of meaning of the original, but you won't have one unity. So there is a destruction of unities. That's the way translation works. And it seems like he wants to say, well, Hölderlin did it in the most incredible way, so much that, you know, he shuts himself in complete isolation and silence. But yeah, it's again this destruction of elements, unities. But what's more difficult to see in the translation is how is this destruction also in the service of the emergence of the whole, which is the higher language, the pure language. Whatever, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah. I wanted to originally to ask, go back to a point in Eva's question. Yeah. But now I can rephrase it in terms of the last question. One point you made about recentering the reading around identity is strangely creates a strange mirror image of a point, an important point in your reading of the Tractatus. I mean, it's a version, but you can say that in the Tractatus, an understanding that identity is not a relation. I mean, refraining from substantializing the relation itself.
Or logical
Logic,
concepts. Exactly.
Identity as a metonymy of logical operations per se, it leads you to an understanding of substance, and there is a kind. It would be hysterical to say that it's kind of discrete multiplicity of substances in the sense he precisely uses substance as a non-countable nouns and so forth. But there is an aspect where you describe the disappearance, the Verschwinden of the logical operations, you precisely get substance. And now, substance. I'm paraphrasing aspects of your reading, basically, but substance also gives you. It's not. You get it's substance is it's an isolated multiplicity, but it gives you the conductivity or connectivity of the whole in precisely being substance or pure content. And now I just want to invite you to say more about why is it that in a way you describe the transition from the first version, or Benjamin described the transition from the first version to the second version, the dissolution of the, let's say, mythologized or fetishized or rigidified version of the gods leads to, let's say, a totality of relations. I know you insisted that the relata disappears as well, but there's I think, an interesting tension there. Right?
I mean, I think, sorry for going a little bit into the Tractatus, but if you think of the gods, let's say, as such, right, there are world aspects that are in harmony. So the fundamental non-relation of gods is a certain understanding of what harmony comes to, when it's not proportions, when it's not external relation. And you could say of the objects of the Tractatus, there's a sense in which each by themselves is something like a substantial element. But Wittgenstein says, no, they are revealed in their application, that is, when they appear. You can't say quite to interpenetrate, because what is it for two objects to cohere? But when you start realizing that, let's say, when space and color interpenetrate, and you think of the dimension of space, which is transparency, and you realize there's no transparent white, then you understand something about the interconnection that forms, the grammar, which is not just a grammar of color, but it's the grammar of space and color, let's say. And I think it's not a coincidence that after you reach that moment, you start speaking about the world, or the world is my world, and, my body is not something preeminent in the world. I mean, there are lots of connections here, and
Yeah, thank you so much. My question is on the relation of one and many. So you started with the task of the earliest program to somehow find a new mythology, and then you made reference to the infinite attributes in Spinoza when you talked about many, and I was wondering how to understand the last stanza, because Hölderlin talks about the himmlischen in plural, but then he says, wenn wir kommen mit Kunst und von den himmlischen einen bringen. So I was just curious how you what exactly is he, or what is the relation between the one and the many and the sensible and the rational, intelligible?
That's interesting. I mean, it seems like, if you think of, again, I'm just throwing things without knowing enough, but how do you apply the gods to the world? Well, you get tragedy, you get, I don't know, the Iliad, you get places where conflict can appear through the finite, but this conflict has the form of ambivalence or ambiguity, right? That's one of the fundamental ways in which Benjamin understands fate. It has to do with ambiguity. And so it were the problematic insertion of the gods into the finite, I want to say, is this space of not destiny, but fate, let's say, which needs to be turned into this coherence of destiny. As it were, immobilized, or ambiguity has to disappear. Now, I think that would be the sense of oneness that you recover. I don't know quite what to make with, bringing one out of the, who? Zeus, Athena, whatever. I mean, I think, well, the issue of what it is to get rid of duplicity, or ambiguity, or a way in which a form of life makes you guilty through that ambiguity, in tragedy, let's say. Benjamin says the tragic hero arrests ambiguity in paradox, and of course, dies from immortality, from, as it were, exhibiting the limits clearly. But that's the movement, and that's the movement, I think, from the metal level that David referred to, from one version of the poem to the concentrated one. It's not a good answer to your question. I see, I don't find a good answer, I would say, in Benjamin. But he does say the heavenly ones themselves are led towards ingathering. So there it's plural, right?
All right, I'm afraid we are out of time now, so please join me in thanking Professor Friedlander.